An experienced captain calculated modifications, tried and tested equipment. How could a fishing vessel disappear in less than 4 minutes when the crew had survived so many seasons? In 1981, the fishing vessel Compass Rose was built in Texas. The vessel measured 25 meters long, 8 meters wide, and 3.8 meters deep, with 3 holds for its catch. At the time, it could carry a maximum of 95 crab pots stacked over 3 levels on deck. Each pot weighed just over 300 kilograms. In 1985, a new owner named David Wilson purchases the vessel and renames it Destination. In 1992, Wilson sends Destination to Seattle, Washington for structural alterations. Workers cut the vessel in half and install a prefabricated hull section with new holds while raising the wheelhouse by 1 meter. These modifications increase Destination's length to 30 meters and width to 9.8 meters. In October 1992, before the modifications are complete, Wilson hires a naval architect to calculate the stability and load requirements. There are no construction plans for the modifications, so the architects make their own vessel drawings to calculate the stability and provide a report. They rely on Destination's captain and part owner Jeff Hathaway for the weight of the pots. In October 1993, the architect produces a trim and stability booklet with instructions for keeping the vessel stable, how much weight to load, and where to place fish pots, fuel, and water. It shows Destination can carry up to 249 pots, each weighing 317 kilograms. In May 2011, there's more work to install a new steel bulwark at the bow. Raising the bulwark provides protection against rough seas and adds over 1.5 tons of weight. David Wilson hires a naval architect to design a bulbous bow below the waterline to reduce drag in the water and conduct a new vessel stability assessment. The architect recalculates the stability using the information from the 1993 trim and stability booklets, and in January 2013, he sends his assessment. The bulbous bow has a negligible effect, and he doesn't issue an updated vessel stability booklet. Another missed opportunity to catch an accumulating problem. Between 2016 and 2000, David Wilson buys 125 new crab pots. The pots themselves weigh 326 kilograms, and when the gear is added, they weigh just under 400 kilograms. Almost 80 kilograms more than the calculations used to produce the original trim and stability booklet. On the 2nd of February 2017, the fleet manager at Trident Seafoods on St. Paul Island tells Wilson that the facility is running low on bait and Destination should bring more bait. Wilson relays this information to Captain Hathaway by text message. 2 days later, on the 4th of February, Destination arrives at Sandpoint, Alaska after 27 days of cod fishing. The crew are tired, bruised, and worn out after grueling shifts, averaging 20 hours on and 4 hours off for almost a month. Under US law, fishing vessels don't have to follow the work-rest requirements that other vessels do. And it's not uncommon for a crew member to work 2 days straight to meet a quota before the season closes. At Sandpoint, the crew waste no time preparing the vessel to catch a pilio or snow crab. They switch out the cod fishing gear and stack crab pots on deck. Captain Hathaway and David Wilson make a plan for the vessel to stop at King Cove and Dutch Harbour to load bait and repair a leak in the exhaust. On the 5th of February at Trident Fuel Dock in Sandpoint, workers load Destination with 57,644 litres of diesel fuel, 3 drums of engine oil, and 1 drum of hydraulic oil. 3 days later, Destination sets off for King Cove. After a 9-hour sail, Hathaway and his crew arrive in King Cove and tie up at Peter Pan Seafoods, where they load just under 1.4 tons of sardine bait. An inspector from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game inspects the vessel and issues a shellfish certificate of inspection, listing a total of 200 crab pots. He reminds Hathaway to notify the Coast Guard of a 24-hour departure window required by Alaska state regulations. The Coast Guard office gets the phone call and asks Captain Hathaway if he'd like a voluntary stability and safety compliance check. It's a 15-minute safety check to confirm that the number of pots on board doesn't exceed the number allowed in the stability instructions booklet. It's not a mandatory check, and Hathaway declines, saying he had this check the previous season and he actually has fewer pots on board. And at 2200, destination departs King Cove for Dutch Harbour. The next day at 18:30 on the 9th of February, the captain of fishing vessel April Lane sees destination sail into Dutch Harbour. Given the National Weather Service warnings for freezing spray, he's alarmed by the vessel's loading condition. He tells a deckhand to take a video on his phone. The National Weather Service issues weather forecasts across the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands twice a day, with freezing spray warnings covering a 48 to 72-hour period. Freezing spray is seawater spray that freezes on cold surfaces, coating the ship with a layer of heavy ice. Many captains hear these warnings and decide to wait until the conditions pass before they sail. Hathaway doesn't wait. The danger for crew with crab pots on deck is that freezing spray builds up on the wire mesh on all sides of every pot across all layers of stacked pots. Destination typically carries 200 pots stacked over 5 levels. They leave a gap down the center line of the deck to use as a tunnel so they can access manhole covers for fish holds number 1, 2, and 3. Holds number 1 and 2 are full of seawater and sealed. Hold number 3 is empty and the hatch is left open so they can access the steering room through hold number 3, which is a requirement in the stability booklet during departure. If they lose steering while sailing in close quarters, they need to be able to access the steering room quickly. Destination ties up at the Kloosterboer cold storage facility to load squid bait. A crew member from another fishing vessel called Ocean Rover sees what he thinks is a large number of crab pots loaded on destination and takes some photos. From 1830 to 1900, the vessel's crew load 4 pallets of squid bait, adding a further 3 tons of weight. But destination's bait freezer can only hold 2.7 tons, and they already have 1.4 tons of sardine bait. The crew loads the rest on top of the crab pots in the middle of the ship, another decision driven by time pressure. At 1900, destination motors to Trident Seafoods. Captain Hathaway leaves the vessel to pick up a gasket so he can repair the main engine's leaking exhaust. While tied up at the Trident Seafoods facility, 2 former destination crew members visit the vessel. Destination's engineer talks about the leaking stuffing box, which separates the propeller shaft from the ocean. It's plagued them throughout the cod season, forcing him to pump water from the engine room bilge every couple of hours. They all head out and Hathaway buys the group dinner. The former crew members can see destination's crew look pretty beaten down after running 24-hour shifts. At 2300, they leave the restaurant and return to their own vessels. Destination casts off from Dutch Harbour en route to St. Paul to store their extra bait before heading west to their fishing grounds. Sailing through the night, crew members take turns standing watch for 1 or 2 hours in the wheelhouse. During the voyage between Dutch Harbour and St. Paul, Hathaway calls Aleutian Lady's captain several times by satellite phone. Aleutian Lady is a fishing vessel in the same cooperative as Destination, working together and sharing resources. Captain Hathaway is late to the crab season because he pushed through a longer cod season. Aleutian Lady's captain says the crab season is slow going, and Hathaway's already lost days collecting extra bait. The pressure is mounting for Hathaway. At 13:30, Hathaway calls the fleet manager at Trident Seafoods in St. Paul to say he's dropping off 5 or 6 pallets of bait for storage. Destination is 14 hours away from St. George Island and will arrive in St. Paul on either Saturday the 11th or Sunday the 12th. The ship's AIS, or Automatic Identification System, shows the vessel on a course of 325 degrees towards St. Paul Island at a speed of about 8 knots after leaving Dutch Harbour. AIS is a tracking system that broadcasts a ship's identity, position, course, speed, and other data to local vessels, shore stations, and satellites. On 2 separate occasions, the AIS track shows destination slowing down, once for about 10 minutes, and a second time for about 60 minutes when its course changes to 043 degrees and its speed slows to 0.4 knots. But 17 nautical miles north of St. George Island, another crabbing vessel, Polar Ice, is heading in the same direction. Fighting through 35-knot winds and 5-meter seas, they stop 4 times for the crew to break ice off the deck with nylon sledgehammers. Each session of breaking ice takes about 5 hours, and they don't have any crab pots on board. Destination does. At 4:57 on the 11th of February, the National Weather Service broadcasts an area forecast. They issue a small craft advisory warning for wind from the northeast and freezing spray throughout the weekend, conditions potentially hazardous to small vessels. At 5 o'clock, Destination crosses the southwestern side of St. George, hiding from the wind behind the island. It holds its course, traveling around 2.5 nautical miles off the western coast, increasing speed up to 9 knots using the protection of the island. The fishing vessel Clipper Surprise takes shelter from the freezing spray on the leeward side of the island, which is protected from the wind. Its captain sees other vessels in Zapadni Bay on his AIS, all with the same idea. They're waiting out the storm. Destination doesn't wait. At 5:55, Destination crosses Dalnoi Point, the northwestern tip of St. George Island. The waters at Dalnoi Point are notorious for their rough sea conditions and strong winds. The tide is running from the south with wind from the northeast going in the opposite direction, forcing sharp waves to break as these 2 competing forces collide. At 6:10, after passing Dalnoi Point, Destination is no longer protected by the leeward side of St. George Island. The wind catches the freezing crab pots like a sail, causing the vessel to heel or lean to the left. To counter, I imagine the helmsman turns Destination to starboard into the wind and waves. But at 6:12, after completing the turn, the headwind forces the vessel to lose speed, slowing it to 0.9 knots. The current under the vessel is flowing at 0.8 knots from behind, cancelling the effect of water flowing over their rudder. Destination loses the ability to steer, and the bow swings all the way through the wind until the vessel is completely turned around at 6:13. Waves splash over the deck, but all the draining ports are blocked by ice. The access hatch for hold number 3 is open and water floods into the ship. Overloaded crab pots, bait stored high on deck, heavy ice accumulating, the top-heavy vessel loses stability. Within a few minutes, the vessel capsizes and sinks. As cold seawater floods the vessel's living quarters, the crew most likely don't have time to get into their immersion suits. Cold water shock can kill you in less than 3 minutes if you don't drown first. Without an immersion suit or life raft, the crew's chances of survival are almost 0. At 6:13, Destination's emergency beacon sends a distress message. The Coast Guard District 17 Command Center, located in Juneau, Alaska, receives the EPIRB distress alert. A minute later, at 6:14, the vessel disappears from their radar screen. Neither the Coast Guard nor any other vessel operating in the area hear or receive any mayday call from Destination. The Coast Guard Command Center tries to call the vessel, but there's no reply. At 6:44, the Coast Guard Mission Coordinator mobilizes a full-scale search and rescue operation. An MH-60 helicopter from Coal Bay prepares to take off, but they have to wait for a second helicopter. Because of the expansive water, the helicopter from Coal Bay can't launch until one from Kodiak is within 2 hours of its position, a safeguard for the crew in case one of the two aircraft ditches into the near-freezing waters. At 7:45, an HC-130 fixed-wing aircraft takes off from Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak, 495 miles from destination's last known position. At 8:09, a Coast Guard MH-60 helicopter tries to take off from Kodiak to serve as an escort for the MH-60 from Coal Bay. But ice accumulates in the engine's inlets while the helicopter taxis on the runway. The pilot has to return to the hangar to de-ice the engine inlets. 30 minutes later, the helicopter at Kodiak is in the sky. Nearby fishing vessels are first to the scene. At 09:30, the crew of Silver Spray find debris and an oil sheen 3.9 nautical miles from destination's last known AIS position. 20 minutes later, Bering Rose arrives but reports no sign of the vessel. At 10:13, after almost 2.5 hours, the Coast Guard HC-130 fixed-wing aircraft flies over St. George Island. The MH-60 helicopter from Coal Bay arrives shortly after. At 11:40, the crew on board Silver Spray recover a life ring with the name Fishing Vessel Destination. The MH-60 helicopter arrives at destination's last known position and locates the EPIRB less than half a nautical mile off St. George Island. The helicopter directs Silver Spray to its location. At 12:25, Silver Spray's crew recovers the EPIRB. On February the 14th, after spending more than 3 days searching 4,972 square nautical miles, the Coast Guard suspends the search. There are no survivors. On July 8, 2017, a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration vessel surveys the area near destination's last known position using side-scan sonar. A target matching the description of destination is located resting on its port side facing southwest in 78 meters of water about 6 nautical miles north of Dalnoi Point. The Coast Guard use an ROV to investigate. They confirm the target is Fishing Vessel Destination. Strong currents prevent them from maneuvering the ROV close enough for a detailed examination of its hull, but they do recover a crab pot. The pot weighs 399 kilograms, including the gear stored inside. That's 82 kilograms more than the stability calculations. With 200 crab pots, almost 2 tons of bait on deck, and ice accumulating rapidly, destination lasted only 4 minutes from the first sign of trouble until its signal was lost.
For more disasters, click the video on screen now.